They called him Owsley Stanley. But to the people who knew him and the world he helped ignite, he was simply Bear, the man who brought acid to the masses, the genius chemist behind the purest, strongest LSD ever made, the patron saint of the Grateful Dead, their financier, their sound engineer, the person responsible for their symbolism and the architect of the wall of sound. Bear didn't just join the counterculture, he electrified it. He turned on an entire generation. He changed music forever, and he became a legend, a symbol of freedom, creativity, and of rebellion. But here's the twist nobody wants to touch. Owsley's life overlapped with government institutions far more than the myth suggests. His grandfather, governor of Kentucky, and a powerful and charismatic U.S. senator who fought against prohibition, often showing up to debates drunk. His father, a high-level federal attorney who worked inside the machinery of the government. Owsley wasn't some disconnected hippie chemist who stumbled into history. He grew up surrounded by politics, power, and the American establishment. So how did a man born into that world become the chemist who fueled the psychedelic revolution? And why do so many of his life events run parallel to, and sometimes directly alongside, the timeline of MK Ultra, the largest known government-sponsored mind control experiment on unsuspecting Americans that was known for its overt use of LSD? Accident? Coincidence? Or a piece of a much stranger puzzle? Let's find out. Born January 19th, 1935 in Washington, D.C., to a family that had served the government for generations, and long before he helped transform rock music and the world forever, his life took a series of weird, almost unbelievable turns. Owsley didn't have a formal background in chemistry. No lab training, no degree. Nothing that would explain how he'd eventually master some of the most complex synthesis processes ever attempted by a private individual. In fact, he didn't even make it through high school. At 15 years old, Owsley was kicked out of military school for one of the most Owsley reasons imaginable. He got nearly his entire freshman class drunk on booze. And instead of continuing his education, in 1950 he was committed, voluntarily, to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, or as it was formerly known as, the Government Hospital for the Insane, Washington, D.C.'s infamous psychiatric institution, a place that decades later, researchers discovered had ties to various intelligence and MK-Ultra adjacent studies on mental illness, hypnosis, trauma, sensory alteration, and experimental treatments, some involving LSD and THC. Human trials involving psychoactive substances were being conducted at St. Elizabeth's prior to even the creation of the CIA, going back to 1943. Even stranger, St. Elizabeth's sits just a short drive distance of both the CIA and FBI's headquarters, as well as many other major federal buildings. His father, a high-powered federal attorney, worked nearby. Owsley spent 15 months there. No diagnosis ever fully explained. No treatment records publicly released. No reason ever given for why he stayed so long or who decided he should be released. A place where he learns not only to solve stated emotional and guilt problems, but also where he learns the study of hypnosis, mastering it by closely observing the doctors that were supposed to be treating him. And also mastering escape, being notorious for breaking out of his room at night to explore the massive 300-acre hospital campus. Was he being treated by these people, or was he being trained for a much bigger experiment that was to come? And here's where things take an even more bizarre turn. After leaving St. Elizabeth's, and with no high school diploma, Owsley was suddenly admitted to the University of Virginia, one of the most selective schools in the country. He studied engineering, for a while, before dropping out again. So let's recap. A teenager expelled from school and committed to a major psychiatric facility is then admitted to a top-tier university without the qualifications to be there. That alone is unusual, but it's the pattern that matters. Because it won't be the last time Owsley's life path bends in ways that feel guided. Random? Maybe. But for a man whose life will later collide with the psychedelic movement, political interests, and covert research programs, these early years raise some serious questions. So, how does a kid who never finishes high school, never earns a diploma, and drops out of college almost immediately somehow slide straight into top secret Cold War rocket research? Because that's exactly what happens next in Owsley Stanley's life. After leaving the University of Virginia, Owsley moves to Los Angeles at age 19, and in one of the most head-scratching twists in his biography, he lands a job working on classified propulsion systems for Cold War military programs. No degree, no credentials, no obvious training, yet he's suddenly working around sensitive aerospace tech at a time when the US was scrambling to beat the Soviets in missile development, when secrecy and security are at an all-time high. This isn't janitorial work. This isn't sweeping the shop floor. This is top-secret propulsion research handled by contractors with federal clearance. And somehow, Owsley gets in the door. Was he brilliant? Yes. But even geniuses need clearances, and Owsley, on paper, shouldn't have been anywhere near this world. And then it gets stranger. After a few years of working on top-secret rocket programs, Owsley abruptly enlists in the U.S. Air Force. He serves 18 months, specializing in electronics, the same field tied to avionics, early surveillance systems, and Cold War intelligence tech. There's no record explaining why he enlisted, or why his service was so short, or what projects he touched. But 18 months is long enough to complete psychological evaluation, receive technical training, run classified clearance checks, and be screened for recruitment into more specialized roles. Then Bear's life flips, again. It's 1958, and out of nowhere, this Cold War Air Force electronics tech, with a politically connected family and a history in federal institutions, becomes a dancer. And not a casual hobbyist. He trains seriously after being inspired by the Bolshoi Ballet, the premier state-run ballet company of the Soviet Union. He even starts learning Russian and French. Think about that. A former Air Force electronics specialist with experience in classified propulsion labs suddenly immerses himself in Russian culture and classical performance arts during the height of Cold War tension. If you wanted to train someone to blend into foreign cultures, to observe without attracting suspicion, to move silently and gracefully in a world of art and music, this is the kind of training you'd give. Is that what happened? We don't know. But the shift is bizarre, and it fits a pattern in Owsley's life. Constant movement between worlds that should never touch. During this time, he would also secure a high-paying seasonal job as a summer relief broadcast engineer, working at various radio and television broadcasting stations. He's married and divorced twice, and becomes the father to 2 children. Now we fast forward to 1963. Owsley is 28. He leaves his job, his wife, his kids, and the ballet in the rearview mirror, and heads for San Francisco to start a new life. The country is a pressure cooker. Student protests are rising. Berkeley is becoming the burning center of the student protest movement. And just 3 months before the Kennedy assassination, Owsley enrolls at UC Berkeley. Again, no high school diploma, no record of completing previous college, no conventional path through academia. Yet he gets in. Again. And as the free speech protests begin, Owsley isn't just on campus. He's present at major demonstrations, implanting himself in a movement that federal intelligence agencies were absolutely obsessed with monitoring. Then, after only a single semester, he drops out. Why? Bad grades, officially. But right after leaving Berkeley,
He becomes the most prolific underground LSD chemist in human history. Not just making acid, creating pharmaceutical-grade LSD that far surpasses government labs. At the exact time the CIA's supply channel through Sandoz laboratories dries up. It's as if Baer stepped in to fill a vacuum left behind by agencies that suddenly had no legal source for the drug they valued so highly. Another coincidence? Maybe. But Owsley's life by this point is a patchwork of coincidences so strange and striking, they start to look like a pattern.
By the mid-1960s, Owsley Stanley wasn't just making LSD, he was shaping the entire psychedelic universe orbiting around it. And here's the part that most documentaries skip. 3 of the biggest names in the early acid scene, Owsley Stanley, Robert Hunter, and Ken Kesey, all had direct brushes with MK Ultra programs. Kesey was dosed at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital through Stanford University, which ran government-funded LSD experiments on volunteers disguised as medical research. Robert Hunter, also a participant in the same Stanford LSD trials. He later became the Grateful Dead's primary lyricist. And Owsley? Well, we've already covered his strange path through St. Elizabeth's Hospital of around 80 known MK Ultra sites. So the core DNA of the Grateful Dead's inner circle comes straight out of the laboratories MK Ultra agents were operating. Now let's talk about the acid tests, because this is where things get almost too on the nose. The CIA's favored delivery methods for LSD included sugar cubes, Kool-Aid, punch bowls, unlabeled beverages, and when Kesey's acid tests exploded across California and Oregon, participants drank LSD-laced Kool-Aid or sucked on sugar cubes while being bombarded with strobes, chaotic sound, sensory overload, disorientation, group suggestion, and music engineered to induce a trance-like state. Exactly the multisensory cocktail MK Ultra researchers were studying for suggestibility, psychological vulnerability, and ego destabilization. So what were the acid tests really? A counterculture party? Or the largest unregulated human experiments ever run, with participants lining up voluntarily? The point is that the methodology of the acid tests mirrored the methodology of MK Ultra precisely. And the government had already been running 10 years of LSD dosing in San Francisco through Operation Midnight Climax, secret brothels run by the CIA, where civilians were drugged without consent and observed behind one-way mirrors. So the idea that intelligence agencies would monitor or infiltrate a scene fueled by Owsley's ultra-pure LSD isn't just plausible, it's predictable. Owsley wasn't just the chemist. He was the brand architect, supplier, its sound engineer, and its main financial backer. He personally helped create the Wall of Sound, the Dancing Bears, the Steal Your Face skull and lightning bolt symbol, the band's entire visual mythology. These weren't just logos, they were sigils, instantly recognizable, emotionally charged, iconic enough to unify millions of people into a single aesthetic tribe, the Deadheads. A fan base so devoted, so cohesive, so enduring, that sociologists often compare it to a decentralized spiritual movement. And this movement, with its built-in communication networks, rules, rituals, and nomadic structure, sprang up around a band that remained politically silent through the most turbulent decade in modern American history. While the country shook with civil rights marches, political assassinations, anti-war protests, the Vietnam draft, and with government mistrust at an all-time high, the Grateful Dead said nothing. No political stance, no condemnation, no rallying cry. They created a pressure release valve inside the counterculture, a place where radical energy was diverted into music, mysticism, psychedelia, personal enlightenment, but not collective action. Whether that was intentional or accidental depends on how many coincidences you're willing to stack before calling it a pattern. History loves to say LSD fueled the 60s revolution, but that isn't the whole story. LSD also fractured it. Civil rights leaders and political strategists of the era complained repeatedly that psychedelic culture pulled thousands of young activists away from protests, marches, and political movements and into a world of tuning out, dropping acid, chasing transcendence, following the band, living for the next show. It created a second counterculture that overlapped with the first, but didn't push social change forward. It siphoned energy, diverted momentum, and replaced political activism with a blissful, music-driven escapism. If your goal was to weaken powerful reform movements like civil rights groups, anti-war coalitions, and leftist organizing, you couldn't have designed a better psychological weapon. You'd create a subculture built on drugs, freedom, and spectacle, one that swallowed disillusioned youth and redirected their revolutionary energy into an endless loop of personal transcendence instead of political mobilization. In fact, COINTELPRO documents show that U.S. intelligence agencies carried out operations to infiltrate, disrupt, and neutralize political movements by dividing and distracting their members. So the idea that psychedelics and music could be used to fog or scatter a population isn't a conspiracy theory. It was written policy. Civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers, and political strategists watched the psychedelic explosion with increasing alarm. They warned that the new drug-driven culture wasn't radicalizing the youth, it was neutralizing them. And they didn't mince words. The Black Panther Party, one of the most disciplined and politically focused organizations of the era, was blunt about what they believed was happening. To them, the sudden rise in drug use sweeping through young people wasn't liberation, it was sabotage. In their 1970 manifesto, Capitalism plus Dope equals Genocide, the Panthers wrote, "Drugs were being flooded into Black communities by the state to destroy the movement from within." To them, the drug culture was not revolutionary, it was counter-revolutionary, a distraction, a fog, a tool to weaken unity and fracture momentum. And they weren't the only ones saying it. Within the growing student movement, leaders of groups like Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, felt the same creeping dread. Todd Gitlin, SDS president and one of the most respected historians of the movement, later reflected on how psychedelics drained political energy from the youth who had once marched, organized, and fought for concrete change. He said, "The Cultural Revolution was the enemy of the political revolution. Psychedelics offered a privatized, internal version of liberation that was essentially a cop-out from the hard work of social change. Drugs provided the illusion of revolution without the substance. They helped turn the movement into a carnival, making it easy for the state to dismiss us as kooks and easy for us to lose our moral compass." Gitlin wasn't guessing. He lived it. He watched thousands of committed young activists get absorbed into a swirling vortex of music, mysticism, and LSD that pulled them out of collective action and into personal transcendence. Even Martin Luther King Jr., the most iconic civil rights leader of the century, issued one of the era's sharpest critiques of the drug-soaked counterculture. He warned, "The hardcore hippie is a remarkable contradiction. He uses drugs to turn inward, away from reality, to find peace and security. Yet he advocates love as the highest human value. Love, which can exist only in communication between people, not in the isolation of the individual." To King, psychedelics didn't expand consciousness, they collapsed it inward. They deadened the relational energy required for real political transformation. They promised enlightenment while eroding solidarity. And in the eyes of King, SDS, and the Panthers, the psychedelic wave didn't empower activism, it dissolved it. 1965, Los Angeles, California. If Owsley Stanley's early life was strange, what comes next seems almost downright impossible. Because somehow, with no formal training, no degree, no lab background, Owsley ends up becoming the world's #1 producer of LSD. And not just any LSD, the purest LSD on the face of the earth. Not good acid, not strong acid. His product was so clean that chemists called it perfect. And Owsley wasn't charging hundreds of dollars for it, as was the street price at the time. He wasn't building a cartel empire. He was giving it away, selling most of it at slightly more than cost, but most times, literally for free. Owsley himself stated that he gave half of his production away. A strange business move to say the least, stating in his own words that he felt he was providing a community service. Most estimates say he produced around 5 million doses that spread through California, then the nation, and eventually the world. And among the people he supplied? The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, the Rolling Stones, Frank Zappa, Bob Dylan, and millions upon millions of ordinary people whose thoughts, opinions, and actions helped shape modern culture. Owsley wasn't just another chemist. He was the source, the fountainhead, the man whose LSD powered the 60s. And yet, for someone pumping millions of doses of what the government considered a powerful mind control weapon into the counterculture and ultimately the homes of Americans across the country, openly, fearlessly, Bear seemed almost magically untouchable. He has the Hells Angels as his personal security, but somehow he also seems to have protection from the law itself. But let's walk through it. The Berkeley Raid, 1965. Police raid Owsley's Berkeley lab looking for amphetamines. They don't find any. Instead, they find a fully operational LSD lab. But LSD wasn't illegal yet, so Owsley does something wild. He sues the police and wins. The court orders the police to return his equipment, his illegal lab equipment, to him. Most people don't win lawsuits against police for raiding a drug lab, but Owsley does, and he keeps right on cooking. The Orinda Bust, 1967. LSD is now an illegal substance in his state. Federal agents raid Owsley's lab in Orinda, California. This time, they find everything: raw LSD, precursor chemicals, equipment, and supplies to manufacture over 1 million doses of LSD. This is the big one. This is the kind of bust that destroys lives. Owsley is arrested. He is convicted. His sentence? 3 years in federal prison and a $3,000 fine. For the man the media had already dubbed the King of LSD. And he stays free on appeal. A slap on the wrist doesn't even begin to cover it. New Orleans, 1970. Now this one defies all logic. Owsley is still out on bail from the million-dose LSD conviction when he and 18 others, including members of the Grateful Dead, are arrested in New Orleans. He's charged with a list of drug possession charges, including LSD, barbiturates, and dangerous non-narcotics. While being out on bail after a federal conviction at the height of America's drug war. And what happens? All charges are mysteriously dropped. Witnesses later repeat a rumor that a $50,000 payoff and a promise to leave Louisiana made everything disappear. Even the dead were shocked at how fast it all went away. This is Louisiana in 1970, a state with a notoriously brutal anti-drug stance. People were getting 10+ years for possession, but Owsley walks out the door. The Oakland Hills Arrest, 1970. 5 months later, still free, though his bail being revoked meant he should be serving his federal sentence, Owsley is arrested again for possession, this time of marijuana and opium. This time, he actually goes to prison, but not the kind of prison anyone else would be sent to. Owsley is sent to Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution, but instead of hard labor or solitary confinement or even standard federal time, he gets a special all-meat diet with steak and milk, access to arts classes and jewelry making workshops, comfortable living conditions, and, unbelievably, a private concert by the Grateful Dead inside the prison. Yes, his favorite band played for him and the guards and inmates inside the prison. This was not normal, even in 1970. Eventually, he's transferred to an even lighter facility, FCI Lompoc, the original country club prison, where he continues metalworking, maintains privileges, and rides out the rest of his reduced sentence. He serves 2 years of a 3-year sentence and walks free. Shortly after release, federal prosecutors charge Owsley with tax evasion, estimating he owed over $149,000 from LSD profits in 1967 and 68. This should be devastating. Lifetime consequences, more jail time. Instead, a judge takes pity on him and reduces the penalty to a $5,000 fine. No jail. Despite being a convicted major drug manufacturer, a tax evader, and a repeat offender who ignored bail conditions during the most aggressive anti-drug period in U.S. history, something or someone was protecting Owsley Stanley. This wasn't luck. This wasn't privilege. This was something else. And Owsley wasn't the only one. His apprentice, Tim Scully, followed an eerily similar path. Scully was another electronics prodigy, a brilliant mind who built high-precision equipment and absorbed advanced chemistry as if it came naturally to him. He teamed up with Owsley to produce massive quantities of LSD, including the famous Orange Sunshine, still remembered in modern culture to this day. And just like Owsley, Scully somehow operated high-purity labs with almost no formal training and almost no early interference. In 1974, when the hammer finally came down, Tim Scully was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for large-scale LSD manufacture. A sentence meant to make an example of him. Instead, it evaporated. Scully served 2 years and 5 months. That's it. For one of the biggest LSD cases in U.S. history. Compare that to the sentencing of small-time offenders in the 1970s, and it becomes very clear. Owsley wasn't the only one who seemed to enjoy protections that no normal citizen ever would. Whether it was influence, interference, or simply an invisible hand guiding outcomes, Bear and his inner circle were playing by a different rulebook. By the mid-70s, one thing was crystal clear. Owsley Stanley hadn't just made LSD, he had engineered an entire culture around it. His acid reached the most influential artists of the era, his branding helped transform the Grateful Dead into a moving myth, and his manufacturing scale helped turn psychedelics from a fringe experiment into a worldwide phenomenon. By the early 70s, the machine he built had taken on a life of its own. Deadhead culture, a swirling mix of fans, nomads, tape traders, artists, vendors, acid chemists, micro-distributors, and makeshift psychedelic communes, became its own ecosystem. The movement Owsley seeded grew into a self-sustaining network that produced and distributed LSD without him lifting a finger. He had created the blueprint, and the counterculture ran with it. So Owsley did something nobody expected. He walked away. In 1982, Owsley quietly left the United States and moved to a remote region of Australia. No more acid labs, no more dead tours, no more counterculture celebrity. Instead, he dedicated himself to metalwork, jewelry, sculpture, esoteric writing, and a fiercely solitary lifestyle. He built intricate silver pieces. He avoided publicity. He avoided crowds. He avoided the very world he helped create. It was as if he wanted to disappear. And maybe that's why he moved to Australia, a place with distance, silence, and no extradition requests looming over him despite decades of legally questionable activity in the US. Just another one of those lucky breaks that seemed to follow Owsley through life. Owsley died in 2011 in a car accident on a rural road in Queensland, Australia. He was 76 years old. No dramatic final act, no confession, no memoir tying everything together. Just a quiet ending to a life surrounded by swirling contradictions. A high school dropout who worked on top-secret military tech. A man with no chemistry training who made the purest LSD ever produced. A counterculture icon who repeatedly walked free from charges that destroyed other people's lives. A political insider's son who helped engineer a movement that conveniently fractured political activism. a cultural architect who slipped quietly into the Australian desert once the machine he built could run without him. So the big question remains. Was Owsley Stanley an idealist chemist who was allowed almost single-handedly to shape a generation, or a piece in a much larger game? Did he spark a psychedelic revolution that liberated the mind, or a mass experiment that redirected a political movement right when it was gaining power? And if the government didn't create Owsley's influence, they certainly benefited from it. Coincidence? Maybe. But history is full of convenient coincidences, and the line between culture and control is often much thinner than we want to believe. Owsley Stanley lived his last years in seclusion, far from the stage lights, far from the laboratories, far from the counterculture he helped shape. He left behind jewelry, artwork, and tens of thousands of pages of private writings that are still slowly trickling out through archives and estates. Maybe somewhere in those pages lies the truth about who he really was. A rebel, a genius, a mythmaker, a cultural architect, or a man whose role in history was never fully his to choose. One thing's certain. When you follow the trail of LSD through the 1960s, you always end up at the same door, Owsley's. And when you knock, the answers get stranger every time.